The desert wind carried whispers of fear across the Apache reservation in the Arizona territory of 1,885. Among the red rocks and endless sky lived a woman whose very presence made grown men step backward and children hide behind their mothers' skirts. Her name was Ayanna, which meant eternal blossom in the Apache tongue. But there was nothing delicate about her towering frame. At 7 feet and 3 inches tall, Ayanna stood like a giant among her people. Her shoulders were broad as a man's, her hands could span a horse's head, and when she walked, the earth seemed to tremble beneath her moccasined feet. The elders said she had been touched by the mountain spirits, blessed or cursed, depending on who told the story. Her grandmother claimed that during Ayanna's birth, lightning had struck the sacred peak 3 times, and the thunder had rolled for 7 days straight. Ayanna's height had been a source of wonder in her childhood, but as she grew into womanhood, that wonder turned to unease. The Apache warriors, brave men who could face down cavalry soldiers without flinching, found themselves uncomfortable in her presence. When she stood beside them, they looked like children reaching only to her chest. The women of the tribe whispered that she was not natural, that something dark lived inside her tall frame. The trouble began when Ayanna reached her 20th year. A group of white settlers had been found dead near the tribal lands, their bodies arranged in a strange pattern. The local sheriff, a man named Jacob Morrison, arrived at the reservation with a posse of angry townspeople. They demanded answers, and when they saw Ayanna standing among the Apache, their faces went pale with terror. "That's no woman," Morrison stammered, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. "That's some kind of monster." The Apache chief, Running Bear, tried to explain that Ayanna was harmless, that she spent her days weaving baskets and gathering herbs like any other woman. But the settlers had already made up their minds. Stories began to spread through the nearby towns about the Apache Giantess who could kill a man with her bare hands, who could outrun a horse and tear down a cabin with her massive strength. The fear grew with each telling. Merchants refused to trade with the Apache while Ayanna remained among them. Children in the white settlements were warned to stay close to home, lest the giant woman come for them in the night. The territorial governor received letters demanding that something be done about the Apache monster. Pressure mounted on the reservation. The Indian agent, a nervous man named Thomas Whitmore, visited Running Bear with an ultimatum from Washington. "The white people are afraid," he said, mopping sweat from his brow as he avoided looking directly at Ayanna. "There will be trouble, maybe war, if something isn't done. You have to understand, Chief. She makes people uncomfortable. They see her and think of violence, of death." Running Bear's weathered face hardened. "Ayanna has never harmed anyone. She is gentle as the morning rain. But she could harm someone," Whitmore insisted. "Look at the size of her. She's stronger than any 3 men. The people in town are terrified. Some are talking about taking matters into their own hands." The threat was clear. If the Apache didn't deal with Ayanna, the white settlers would. Running Bear knew his people couldn't survive another war. Too many had already died fighting the blue coats. The reservation was all they had left, and even that hung by a thread. The decision came after a long council meeting that lasted 3 days and nights. The elders spoke in hushed tones about the greater good, about protecting the tribe from the anger of the white man. Ayanna sat in the center of the circle, her head held high despite the words that cut deeper than any blade. She understood what was happening. To save her people, she would have to leave them. "There are men who hunt dangerous animals," Running Bear said finally, his voice heavy with shame. "Professional hunters who track bears and wolves for the government. They have agreed to take you far from here, where you cannot frighten the white people anymore." Ayanna's mother wept openly, but Ayanna herself remained silent. She had always known this day might come. Her size made her a target, a symbol of everything the white world feared about the Apache. She nodded once, accepting her fate with the dignity of her ancestors. The hunters arrived the next morning as the sun painted the desert gold. There were 3 of them, hard men with cold eyes and rifles slung across their backs. Their leader was a grizzled man named Dutch Hendricks, who made his living tracking down problem animals for the territorial government. He looked Ayanna up and down like she was livestock, calculating her worth and the effort it would take to transport her. "She's even bigger than they said," Dutch muttered to his companions. "Going to need special restraints for this one." They had brought chains, heavy iron shackles that were normally used for the largest bears. The metal was cold against Ayana's wrists and ankles, and the weight of it made walking difficult even for someone of her strength. The Apache watched in silence as their daughter was loaded into a reinforced wagon like a caged animal. As the wagon rolled away from the only home she had ever known, Ayana looked back once at the faces of her people. Some showed relief that the source of their troubles was gone. Others displayed shame at what they had been forced to do. Her mother ran alongside the wagon for a mile before exhaustion forced her to stop, her cries echoing across the desert long after Ayana could no longer see her. The journey east began that day, carrying Ayana toward an uncertain future. Dutch Hendricks had been hired to transport her to a traveling exhibition in Kansas, where curious people would pay money to see the wild Apache Giantess. She would be displayed like a circus animal, her heritage and humanity stripped away for the entertainment of strangers. The chains that bound her were just the beginning of a captivity that would test every ounce of strength and spirit she possessed. The wagon wheels creaked and groaned across the rough terrain as days blurred into weeks. Dutch Hendricks and his men treated Ayana like the dangerous animal they believed her to be. They fed her scraps from their meals, never removing the heavy chains that rubbed raw wounds on her wrists and ankles. At night, they secured additional ropes around her while she slept on the hard wooden floor of the wagon, ensuring she could barely move. The journey took them through dusty towns and sprawling cattle ranches, where curious onlookers gathered to peer at the Apache monster behind the wagon's iron bars. Children threw rocks while their parents stood at a safe distance, pointing and whispering about the unnaturally tall woman who sat silently enduring their stares. Dutch would sometimes charge a nickel for people to get a closer look, turning Ayana's misery into profit even before reaching their destination. After 3 weeks of travel, they arrived in Dodge City, Kansas, where Dutch handed Ayana over to a traveling exhibition called Professor Blackwood's Museum of Human Curiosities. The so-called professor was a thin man with a waxed mustache who examined Ayana like she was merchandise, checking her height against a measuring stick and making notes in a leather-bound book. "Magnificent specimen," Professor Blackwood declared, rubbing his hands together. "The crowds will come from miles around to see her. We'll bill her as the last of the Apache warrior women, a savage giantess from the untamed West." They built a special cage for her exhibition, with bars thick enough to contain a grizzly bear. The cage was barely tall enough for Ayana to stand upright, forcing her to hunch her shoulders constantly. A small platform allowed paying customers to climb up and look down at her from above, making her seem even more like a caged beast. The professor dressed her in a crude imitation of Apache clothing made from cheap leather and fake feathers, nothing like the beautiful traditional dress her grandmother had taught her to make. Every day brought new humiliation. The professor would ring a bell and announce her to crowds as the terrifying Apache Giantess, making up wild stories about her supposed violent past. He claimed she had killed dozens of settlers with her bare hands, that she could snap a man's neck like a twig, that she was the last of a race of giant warriors who once terrorized the frontier. None of it was true, but the crowds ate up every lie. People would prod her with sticks through the bars, trying to make her roar or show aggression. Some threw peanuts like she was an animal at a zoo. Others made crude comments about her size and appearance that made her want to weep, but she kept her face stone still, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her pain. The Apache had taught her that dignity was something that could never be taken away, only surrendered. Months passed in this degrading routine. Ayana's spirit, once as vast as the Arizona sky, began to shrink like a flower deprived of water. The constant confinement weakened her body despite her natural strength. Her long black hair, once her pride, became dull and matted. The wounds from her shackles never properly healed, developing into painful sores that the professor ignored despite her obvious suffering. The exhibition traveled from town to town across Kansas and Nebraska, drawing crowds wherever they went. In some places, local newspapers wrote sensational articles about the wild woman of the West, further cementing the myths surrounding Ayana. Religious groups protested that displaying her was sinful, while others argued she was evidence of divine punishment for the Apache people's resistance to civilization. It was in Lincoln, Nebraska, during the autumn of 1886, that everything began to change. The exhibition had set up in a field outside town, and as usual, crowds gathered to gawk at Professor Blackwood's collection of human oddities. Among the usual mix of farmers, townspeople, and curious travelers stood a tall cowboy who seemed different from the rest. His name was Samuel Sam Morrison, though he bore no relation to the sheriff who had first brought trouble to Ayana's tribe. Sam was a cattle driver who had spent years moving herds across the open range, a man who understood the vastness of the frontier and respected the peoples who had called it home long before white settlers arrived. Unlike the other spectators, he didn't point or laugh or make crude remarks. He simply stood quietly, watching Ayana with sad, thoughtful eyes. Sam had encountered Apache people during his travels, trading with them and learning to respect their skills as warriors and survivors. He had even learned some of their language during a winter spent recovering from a broken leg in an Apache camp, where the people had shown him nothing but kindness despite his being a white stranger. Seeing Ayana caged like an animal stirred something deep in his chest, an anger he hadn't felt since watching buffalo hunters slaughter entire herds just for their hides. That evening, Sam returned to the exhibition grounds after the crowds had gone home. The other attractions had been covered for the night, but Ayana's cage remained exposed to the cold Nebraska wind. She sat huddled in the corner, her massive frame trying to find warmth in the thin blanket Professor Blackwood had provided. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and Sam could see her shivering despite her attempts to appear strong. "Ma'am," Sam called softly in Apache, using one of the few phrases he remembered. The words meant, "Peace to you." Ayana's head snapped up in surprise. It had been over a year since she had heard her native language spoken with anything approaching respect. She looked at this cowboy standing outside her cage, noting his worn leather chaps, his weather-beaten hat, and most importantly, the genuine compassion in his blue eyes. "You speak Apache?" she asked in English, her voice hoarse from disuse. "A little," Sam admitted. "I learned some winters ago from your people. They showed me kindness when I needed it most." He paused, studying her face in the moonlight. "This ain't right, what they're doing to you. This ain't human." Ayana felt tears prick her eyes for the first time in months. Someone finally saw her as a person rather than a curiosity. "There is nothing that can be done," she said quietly. "I am property now. Bought and sold like cattle." Sam's jaw tightened. "No person should be property. That's supposed to be over in this country." He looked around the empty grounds, then back at her. "I'm going to figure out a way to help you. I don't know how yet, but I give you my word." For the next several days, Sam followed the exhibition as it moved to the next town. He watched and learned the routines, noting when the guards were present and when Ayana was left alone. He observed Professor Blackwood's habits, the layout of the camp, and the weaknesses in their security. Most importantly, he began to formulate a plan that might just be crazy enough to work. The chain that had bound Ayana to this life of degradation was strong. But Sam had spent his life working with his hands, and he knew that every chain had a weak link. He just had to find it and be brave enough to break it when the time came. Sam Morrison spent 2 weeks studying the exhibition's routine before he found his opportunity. The traveling show had set up camp outside Grand Island, Nebraska, near a railroad crossing where freight trains stopped regularly for water and coal. Professor Blackwood had grown careless with security, confident that no one would dare steal his prized attraction. The heavy chains and iron cage seemed like enough deterrent for anyone foolish enough to consider freeing the dangerous Apache woman. The plan Sam devised was simple but risky. He had noticed that every night around midnight, the single guard Professor Blackwood hired would make his rounds, then settle down for a bottle of whiskey by the main tent. The man usually drank himself into a stupor within an hour, leaving the entire camp unguarded until dawn. Sam had also discovered that a freight train heading west stopped at the crossing every Tuesday night, taking on water for nearly 20 minutes before continuing toward Colorado. On a cold Tuesday evening in November, Sam put his plan into action. He waited in the shadows until the guard had finished his rounds and begun his nightly drinking ritual. Then, moving as quietly as his boots would allow on the frost-covered ground, Sam approached Ayana's cage with a set of bolt cutters he had purchased in town. "Don't make a sound," he whispered in Apache as he began working on the lock. "We're going to get you out of here." Ayana's heart raced as she watched Sam strain against the heavy metal. The bolt cutters were barely strong enough for the thick iron, and each squeeze produced a small grinding noise that seemed loud as thunder in the quiet night. Sweat beaded on Sam's forehead despite the cold air as he worked, constantly glancing toward the main tent, where the guard's lantern cast a flickering glow. After what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, the lock finally gave way with a soft snap. Sam carefully opened the cage door, wincing as the hinges creaked in protest. Ayana had to crawl out because the cage opening wasn't tall enough for her to stand upright. But once outside, she straightened to her full height and breathed deeply of the free air. "The chains," she whispered, lifting her shackled hands. Sam had anticipated this problem. The bolt cutters weren't strong enough for the thick iron shackles around her wrists and ankles, but he had another solution. From his saddlebags, he produced a small file and began working at the metal links. It was slow, tedious work that sent tiny metal filings sparkling in the moonlight. Every few seconds, Sam would pause to listen for sounds from the guard's tent. But the man's snores indicated he was deep in his whiskey-induced sleep. As Sam filed away at the chains, Ayana flexed her stiff muscles and looked around at the camp that had been her prison. Part of her wanted to kick over Professor Blackwood's tent, to wake him and show him what real Apache anger looked like. But she knew that would only bring pursuit. And Sam was risking his life for her freedom. Revenge would have to wait. The sound of a train whistle in the distance made them both freeze. Their transportation west was approaching, but the chains were only half cut through. Sam worked faster, the file heating up in his hands from the friction against the metal. Finally, with another train whistle echoing across the prairie, the last link parted. "Can you run?" Sam asked, gathering up the pieces of chain so they wouldn't be found immediately. Ayana flexed her legs, feeling strength return to her massive frame. "I can run faster than the wind when I need to," she said, and Sam believed her. They made their way quickly but carefully across the camp, avoiding the areas where other performers slept in their wagons. The train was visible now, its headlight cutting through the darkness as it approached the water stop. Steam billowed from the engine, and the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails grew louder with each passing second. When they reached the edge of camp, Sam grabbed Ayana's hand and they ran. Her long legs carried her easily across the uneven ground, and Sam had to push himself to keep up with her pace. Behind them, the camp remained quiet. Professor Blackwood and his people unaware that their star attraction was escaping into the night. The train had stopped at the water tower when they reached the tracks. Sam had scouted the freight cars earlier and knew which ones would be unlocked. He chose an empty cattle car near the back of the train, sliding the heavy door open just enough for them to squeeze inside. The car smelled of hay and animals, but to Ayana, it was perfume compared to the stench of her cage. They climbed aboard just as the train whistle sounded again, signaling departure. The locomotive lurched forward, wheels spinning briefly on the rails before gaining traction. As the train picked up speed, Sam slid the car door shut, leaving them in darkness but finally safe from immediate pursuit. For several minutes, neither spoke. The reality of what had just happened was still sinking in. Ayana sat with her back against the car wall, feeling the train's motion carry her farther from her captors with each passing moment. Sam sat nearby, his heart still racing from the dangerous rescue. "Why?" Ayana asked finally. "Why risk your life for a stranger?" Sam was quiet for a long moment, listening to the train wheels clicking over the joints in the rails. "I spent a winter with your people once," he said. "I was hurt. Alone. And they took me in, when they could have left me to die. Your grandmother, maybe it was, she tended my broken leg and fed me soup every day until I was strong again. Never asked for nothing in return. Just showed kindness to someone who needed it." Ayana's breath caught. Her grandmother had indeed mentioned a injured white man they had helped years ago. A cowboy with kind eyes who had learned some Apache words during his recovery. "Evening Star was my grandmother," Ayana whispered. "She spoke of you sometimes." said you were different from other white men." Sam nodded in the darkness. She was a wise woman. Taught me that people are people, no matter what they look like or where they come from. When I saw you in that cage, I heard her voice telling me to do what was right. The train carried them through the night toward Colorado, toward the mountains where Ayanna had never been but somehow felt calling to her. Sam had planned their route carefully, knowing the train would take them far from Professor Blackwood's reach and close to territories where a person could disappear if they wanted to start fresh. As dawn broke over the Colorado plains, Ayanna saw her first sunrise as a free woman in over a year. The sky painted itself in shades of pink and gold that reminded her of the Arizona desert she had lost. Tears flowed down her cheeks, but for the first time in months, they were tears of hope rather than despair. "Where will you go?" Sam asked as the train began to slow for another water stop. Ayanna considered the question. She could try to return to Arizona, to her people on the reservation, but she knew that would only bring trouble back to them. The whites would still fear her, still see her as a threat, but now she had something she hadn't possessed before. The knowledge that not all white people were her enemies. "West," she said finally. "To the mountains, where the sky is big and people can be who they are meant to be." When the train stopped in Denver, Sam helped her down from the cattle car. They parted ways at the station, but not before Sam pressed a small bag of coins into her hands. Money he had been saving for winter supplies but now gave freely to help her start a new life. "You're not too tall to handle," Sam told her as they said goodbye. "You're exactly as tall as you're supposed to be. Don't let anyone make you feel different about that." Ayanna used the money to buy proper clothes and supplies for the journey into the Colorado mountains. She found work at a ranch owned by an elderly widow who valued strong hands over appearances and asked no questions about her past. For the first time in her adult life, she was judged not by her unusual height but by her willingness to work and her gentle nature with the animals. Years later, stories would occasionally surface about an unusually tall woman who lived in the high country, who could gentle wild horses with a whisper, and whose knowledge of mountain herbs could cure ailments that stumped town doctors. Some called her the Mountain Lady, others whispered she was an Apache spirit watching over travelers. But those who actually met her knew her simply as Anna, a kind woman who had found peace in the thin air and endless sky of Colorado's peaks. The chain that had once bound her was broken forever. Not just by Sam's bolt cutters, but by the simple act of one human being seeing another's suffering and choosing to act. In freeing Ayanna, Sam had proven that fear could be overcome by compassion, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was simply recognize the humanity in someone others had chosen to deny.